4 and 5, a lot of students might have class, and so they might not be able to attend it, but they will be attending. They will watch the recording at a later date. Um, and so we shall we just wait for a few minutes to see if somebody joins, and then we can go. Right. Thanks.
Hi, Vishnupriya. Can we start at 4:10? Like, we can wait for some time for somebody to join and then we can start, right? Is that fine?
Sure, I have no problems waiting for another 10 minutes. I mean, 5, 10 minutes, yeah.
Okay, we can start at 4:10. Okay.
Sure. Okay.
So I think we can start this session today. Good evening, everyone. My name is Umesh Srinivasan, and I am one of the core people involved in fundamentals in ecology. And we're joined today by Dr. Vishnupriya Shankar Raman. Thank you very much for joining us and talking to us about your work. Very much appreciated. Dr. Shankaraman is a scientist with the Wildlife Conservation Society India program, which is a very large and effective non-governmental organization that has been working in conservation across India, both terrestrial systems and marine systems for a long time now. And what Dr. Shankaraman does is that one of the many things that she does is that she works on agroforests, which are these landscapes where you have a mix of both agriculture, things like tea plantations, coffee plantations, but you also have either patches of native forest or you might have native trees and native vegetation interspersed within this agricultural landscape. And that makes this landscape not only important for agricultural production, but also important for biodiversity and wildlife conservation. And so Dr. Shankaraman is going to tell us about her research on agroforests today and how these landscapes can benefit conservation, especially in this country. So thank you once again, and please, Dr. Shankaraman.
Thanks a lot, Umesh, for inviting me to give this talk. Am I audible to everybody here?
Yes, you're audible.
Great. And can I share my screen? Yes, I do have. There we go. Can everyone see that?
We can, yes, it's in full screen now.
Great. So as Umesh introduced me, I am a community ecologist and a scientist at WCS India. I've been working with them on and off for about 15 years now. But in the current position that I'm in, I've been working as a scientist heading the agroforest biodiversity program for the last 2.5 years. And we largely focus on lesser fauna, including amphibians, reptiles, and potentially other taxa going forward, and looking at how these human use landscapes, agricultural landscapes, can be managed better for conservation. And today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on our work on amphibians across a few different agro production landscapes in the Western Ghats. So to start with, this is a concept in conservation ecology called land sharing versus land sparing. I'm not sure if that's a topic that's already been approached and spoken about on this course before, but basically, in a world where we have closing on 8 billion people and counting and expecting to grow to about 11 billion people, how do you feed everybody while also setting aside land for conservation? And we're also making commitments, right, to meet the sustainable development goals. India has made commitments along with a bunch of other countries on a 30 by 30 basis, which is that we will have 30% of land and sea under some form of protection by 2030. So how do we do all of this? Feed the world, have economic growth and development while also meeting all of these criteria. And there are two ways that have historically been thought of, and those are called land sharing and land sparing. And I'll explain what those are. So traditionally, what we thought of as the right way to do conservation is the land sparing approach. And actually, most papers show that it is in some ways the more effective way to do conservation, which is you set aside large reserves that are entirely for wildlife, you keep people out, and they are conserved for ecosystems and wildlife and not for human use. So if you think of the most uh, like typical protected areas, conservation landscapes all over the world, whether it's the Patagonia National Park, Yellowstone, Komodo Dragon National Park, all of these Kruger, you can imagine, like in India, we have Corbett and Ranthambore and Nagaroli and things like that. So these are all supposed to be large landscapes that are set aside entirely for wildlife and conservation. And traditionally, we followed this method, but also research indicates that this might be better for conservation. But in much of the world, there isn't that much space to set aside large landscapes for conservation. So if you see India, we are at over 60% of land in some form of crop or grazing lands or some form of agriculture. And so is a lot of Europe, all of Eastern United States, and a large part of the world has no area set aside for these large protected area type of models of conservation. That's when we can think of the land sharing approach. The land sharing approach basically is that areas that we use as human beings for our needs can also be done in a way that's more sustainable and allows for animals, biodiversity, ecosystems to flourish within human use landscapes. So here are some examples of what that looks like. And from these images, you can tell that not all of these are equal, right? So you can see up here, there's a grazing land, pasture land with cattle out. What you see in the bottom left is clearly a monoculture plantation with a single tree species that's planted. And here in the bottom left, you have aquaculture and paddy culture done simultaneously, where you can have fisheries and grain production in the same space and allow for some biodiversity in the farm edges. And then you have the fourth example up here, which is a agroforest, where you have mix of native and non-native tree species under which there are other mixed crops. And this is called an agroforest model. And so all of these are human use landscapes. You can see them in their different forms, and you can see structurally they're different, right? Just by the shape, the textures of the vegetation that you see, they're very different. And so what they're able to host as biodiversity is also very different. So as you can imagine, what you saw in that bottom left as a monoculture tree plantation versus the top right, which is an agroforest, you will expect to see very, very different types of species. Here, imagine I went to a site and saw the bottom three species, and I went to another location and I saw the top three species. I can guarantee that all of you who are watching this will have likely seen all of the three bottom species, right? And you probably are going to be able to guess where you can see them, which is pretty much anywhere. You can see them in a city, you can see them in farms, you can see them in rural landscapes and in forests. And this is the common toad, the bonnet macaque, which is common in southern India, and a large-billed crow. And then in the top are more habitat special species. These are species that you will find in forests or in areas where they need very specific kinds of habitats, right? And so these kind of how species use space, especially spaces that we share with them, will depend on what that landscape is able to provide. So now a monoculture plantation is likely going to be able to have all these bottom three species, at least to some extent. Whereas it's unlikely to have the top four species, right? Because they are habitat specialists. So the more intensely we use a landscape, the less likely it is to have specialized species and more likely to have generalized species. And so species communities vary by habitat, by land use, and the way we manage them. And this has been shown with multiple species all over the world. And I'm going to show you through a few studies that I've worked on how amphibian communities also follow these kind of similar patterns and what can we do to help manage these landscapes better, make them less intensive, more sustainable, and have more space for amphibian conservation. So, but why am I talking about amphibians first? We could have picked any group of animals, insects, plants, potentially even. My work is focused on amphibians for multiple reasons. First is that they require both freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems. So with that one group of animals, you're able to say something about the land as well as the freshwater bodies around them. Another reason is they're very diverse, especially in a tropical country like India. We have lots of species that all react in different ways to different habitats. And so we're able to say something about communities rather than, say, mammals, which tend to be of fewer species very often. And also because they require very, very different kinds of microhabitats and habitats. So for example, here I've given three examples, not necessarily of frogs in India, but they're all similar. Frogs are found everywhere in the world. The bottom left is a cascade frog, so it literally needs waterfalls to live in. The center is a leaf litter frog. It needs a healthy forest floor like habitat with lots of leaf litter in it. And then here on the right is a tree hollow. So here's a frog that's breeding inside a tree hollow. And amphibians need very, very specific kinds of microhabitats, which also tells us something about the landscapes we're using, how we're using them, and do we make space for microhabitats within those landscapes. So a lot of my work has been in the Western Ghats, which is also one of the world's most biodiverse regions, especially for amphibians. There are over 280 species of described amphibians from the Western Ghats right now, and almost 90% of them are endemic, which means they're found nowhere else in the world. And so this is a good group to work on agroforest biodiversity and try to use them as a model to understand better management practices in agroforest. The first study I'll talk to you about is a study I did a few years ago on the management of microhabitats in plantation landscapes, especially across three plantation types: areca plantations, coffee plantations, and rubber plantations. And if you look at these three pictures, you'll see that areca on the left is actually grown in a mixed crop way. So areca plantations very rarely have just areca. They'll be mixed with other fruiting trees like coconuts, jackfruits, even cocoa plants, and a lot of pepper vines growing along the trunks of the areca palm, things like that. So they're very heavily mixed cropped with a whole bunch of other commercially important species. Coffee, on the other hand, as you can see in the middle, is a shrub. It's not a tree. So it's grown under a forest canopy. So all of India's coffee, at least, is shade-grown coffee, which means that over the coffee plants, there's the shade of other trees, and largely in the Western Ghats, a lot of native tree species. So it almost looks like a forest if you were to look from above through a drone, whereas at the bottom, there's no undergrowth of forest. It's all coffee farms. And the third agroforests we worked in were rubber plantations. And unlike rubber in other parts of the world, for example, in Southeast Asia and Central America, rubber is often mixed cropped in an agroforest framework where there are lots of other forest trees in the rubber plantations. But in India, unfortunately, rubber is a monoculture crop. So all you see is a single crop of rubber, nothing else. And then the undergrowth usually has this invasive creeper called Mycenium that takes over the understory entirely. And so there's just two species of plants in the entire rubber farm, the way it's managed in the Western Ghats. So obviously there are three very different intensity of uses, as you can tell. And I was curious to see how species would react to these intensities of use. And as you would, the study area that we worked in was in Karnataka, because Karnataka grows one of the highest areca yield anywhere in the world, actually. And then it's also the highest coffee growing area of India. And then rubber, it's not as big as Kerala, but it still has a fair amount of rubber farms coming up now, especially in the western part of the Western Ghats. Yeah. So we looked at plantations across Karnataka's Western Ghats, and what we found, as you'd expect, was that, of course, coffee, being the most diverse with forest canopy and things like that, had the highest species richness. So we found a total of 26 frog species across the study area, but the average coffee plantation had about 10 and a half odd species per plantation, whereas the average rubber and areca plantations had much lower, around 5 to 7 species per plantation. And that was expected. We thought areca will actually have slightly higher species richness than rubber because it's mixed crop. But what we realized was a lot of areca plantations were very far away from forest edges, but a lot of our rubber plantations were right next to forest edges. So even though they're highly disturbed and highly intensely used habitats, some of those forest frogs were occasionally using the rubber plantations, if not to breed in and live in, they were at least intermittently using them. So we found more species than we expected in rubber. But then we looked at the microhabitat availability and what can individual planters do at their local scale. So whether you're a coffee plantation owner, an areca plantation owner, or rubber plantation owner, what can you do to improve the habitat? And we found that microhabitats were the most important. So we looked at three microhabitats. We looked at the presence of ponds, streams, and footpaths. As you can tell, amphibians have two life stages, which means the tadpoles live in water, the adults live on land, which means water bodies like ponds and streams are very important, which is why we included those two. And then we used footpaths actually. Here it says road, but actually these are footpaths in the plantations, mainly because most of these plantations, as you could tell from photos, are tree plantations, right? So they have vertical structuring in their vegetation. Whereas these roads, footpaths in the monsoon, because it's raining so heavily, all of the footpaths get covered with grasses. So it's almost like these linear grassland strips running through these forest-like habitats. So they provide an extra unique habitat that's not available otherwise in a plantation. And we found that presence of ponds especially really increased species richness, as did footpaths. And then the combination of all three microhabitats. So if a planter who didn't have a microhabitat was able to introduce a pond or restore stream flow, for example, if it's bundled or dammed upstream, or leaves the footpath metalled roads in his plantation, then he can increase the species richness of his plantation by 75%, which is a huge amount. So if you have 10 species, you're going to see a 75% increase in the number of species you see in the average plantation. So this was our small scale study result from the first study. Now I'm going to talk about a second study we worked in, and this is slightly at a wider scale, which is to look at, okay, so you're not a small scale farmer, you're a mid to large scale farmer, and you have a larger landscape to work with. How do you identify which are the vulnerable species and habitats, and where should you focus your interest efforts in that landscape? And for this study, we looked at forest fragments, which, as you can tell here, are highly close canopy. So there's forest right over the stream. It has a lot of rocks, fallen logs, and other um, microhabitats in the stream itself. Whereas coffee is a little bit more disturbed. There's still forest trees on the edge, but it's not a fully closed canopy. And there's less fallen logs, less rocks in many coffee streams. And in the tea plantations, it's completely denuded. There are no trees along the stream edge other than a few silver oak, which are not native to this landscape. And what has happened is because all of the trees have been chopped off, there's been a lot of soil erosion over the years, and they've all sedimented in the stream valleys. So the stream valleys have become really eutrophied, which means that the water is barely flowing. It's sludgy, very slow moving, or almost stagnant water, and it's getting filled up with vegetation. As you can see, all of these grasses and shrubs here have overtaken the stream itself. There are no rocks, there are no fallen logs. The landscape has completely changed. So these tea streams barely look like streams. And we looked at how amphibians are adapting to these three land uses and which types of species are most affected by these kind of habitat changes that streams face in different land uses. And for this study, I worked in the Anamalai landscape, the Valparai Plateau, which is in Tamil Nadu. And this is a landscape that is surrounded by national parks and tiger reserves. So if you see this green patch in the middle, this is all tea. And the darker green patches in the middle of those are forest fragments. The brown patches are coffee. And around all of these are national parks. So there's Anamalai Tiger Reserve here, Paramikulam Tiger Reserve. So there's this 250 square kilometers of plantations that is literally surrounded in all 360 degrees directions by national parks and tiger reserves. And also because of the geography of this landscape has so many river valleys and stream valleys that it's highly networked with a lot of streams. You can tell all these blue lines are actually higher order streams that are in this landscape. So I looked at tea, coffee, and forest fragments in this landscape to see how the amphibians adapt to these different habitats. And in this study, we found 33 species of frogs from 8 different families. And we broke up these species into the ways they breathe. So basically, three categories. Frogs that prefer stagnant or slow moving waters to breathe in, like the habitat I showed you in the tea plantations. Uh, Frogs that need torrent flowing water, so they lay their eggs in fast flowing streams, and frogs that lay their eggs directly on land. So these are terrestrial frogs that breed terrestrially, and they don't have a tadpole stage. They don't need water, so they directly develop into little frogs without water. So we thought, depending on what kind of breeding strategy they use, they will be able to adapt differently to tea, coffee, and forests. Um, and what we found was that the species present for stagnant water breeding frogs and the direct developing terrestrial frogs was actually not very different. Can you all still hear me? Was that just a recording message or was I losing network?
No, we can hear you. That's just a
Okay,
recording
great.
message.
Okay, great. Yeah. So what you can see out here is basically that leftmost is the coffee farms, middle is the forest, and the right is the tea farms. And you can see that the direct developing, the terrestrial frogs have very similar probability of being there in these habitats across the three. And so is it in the case of stagnant water frogs. But it's the torrent breeding, the fast water breeding frogs that are much higher in forests than in tea or coffee. So it's these frogs that are more vulnerable, and these habitats, the torrent habitats that are more vulnerable. And so even though coffee has some amount of torrent habitat, they still have much lower presence of these torrent breeding frogs than intact forests seem to have. So that was basically, let me go back actually one sec. Yeah. So that to me was an important result coming from this study. So if you're a small farmer, add microhabitats. If you're a mid-sized farmer, so if you have larger valleys of plantations, restoring and maintaining stream size can be a very important way for you to conserve amphibians. And then the last part of this study that I'm going to show you is looking at larger spatial patterns in terms of species composition. So what kinds of species are together found in which landscape? So in the first case, we looked at richness, which is the total sum of species. The second, we looked at specific breeding guilds, habitat guilds, and things like that. And here we're looking at composition, which is basically, let me give you an example with coral reefs, because you can see a lot in these two images. And if you can look at these two images, you will see that there are certain species like this fish here and this fish here are similar. If you look similarly with corals, there are overlapping species. But you can also see fishes in this that are not there in this right side image. Similarly, fishes in the image here that are not in the image here. So there are groups of animals or plants in any landscape that are common between two habitats or two locations or two sites, and those that are completely different, right? And as you can imagine, if you go farther away from any point you're standing in, you will see more and more different species, and your species composition will keep changing. And so you will have more different compositions. And this can be across different scales. It can be elevation. So you start at the base of a mountain, you keep climbing, and the types of trees you see, the type of animals you see will keep changing as you go up the mountain. Similarly, with rainfall, say you have really high rainfall locations and low rainfall locations, the further you walk away from any location, the more changes you're going to see. And so this causes something called turnover in species, where new species are added and other species are lost. And this is also called the beta diversity of any two locations. And so the study I'm going to show you is how beta diversity between locations are different. And this is the same study that I showed you earlier in Valparaiso Plateau, looking at streams in tea, coffee, and forests. So, for example, let's look at these three locations, right? Spatially, they'll almost look identically far apart, right? I think from my memory, they're all about 2 kilometers apart from each other. And the bottom left stream here is flowing through a forest fragment. The top one here is flowing through a coffee plantation, and the bottom right here is flowing through a tea plantation. So they're also in different land uses. And then if you look at stream distance, right? So you can look at direct geographic distance, how far they are apart, or you can look at how far they are apart along the stream. So this one is about 10 kilometers in length. But these 2 points, if you see, are really far apart. You have to almost go down to a river basin and come back up, right? So they're really far apart in the river basin. So any aquatic species that moves through water is going to find it much harder to move from this spot to this spot than it is between these two spots. And then the third geographic difference between these three locations is that they're very different in elevation. So these two locations are really far apart in the stream, but they're only 250 meters apart in elevation. Whereas these two, which are much closer along the stream, are 550 meters apart in elevation. So I was curious to look at how land use and these different geographic distances influence how species turn over and how this beta diversity is changing across this landscape. And what we found was that, so here is a figure where each point is one site. So I had about 227 transects along streams and along plantations in the study area, and each point represents one of these transects. And so I wanted to see how different they are depending on the land use and the habitat. So land use here again is coffee, tea, or forest, and the habitat is whether it was in the plantation or in the water, in the stream itself. And so interestingly, you will see all the coffee stream sites are clumping here, whereas all the coffee plantation sites are clumping here. Oh, sorry, that was, yeah. So, and then if you look at all the forest streams are up here, all the forest terrestrial lands are here. And strangely, tea is right in the middle. And this was unexpected for me because if you think about it, the coffee farms actually visually look a lot more like forests, right? They have pretty much similar tree cover, and the streams are much more alike than a tea stream is to either of them, or a tea landscape is to either of those forests or coffee. And so I thought coffee and forest will be more similar, those polygons will be more closer, and then tea will be further away from each of them. But strangely, that was not what we found. What we found was that coffee farms had their own unique species compositions. Forest had its own unique species compositions. And everything in the middle actually are really common. So this species, for example, that's written here in the middle is the common Indian toad. This is the skittering frog. This is the Wayanad bush frog. And most of these species are basically found anywhere. They're generalists. They're able to adapt to all of the habitats. So tea was basically in the middle because it had overlapping generalist species with both coffee and forest, whereas both the other land uses, coffee and forest, had very unique species compositions. So I realized that conserving coffee streams just by themselves is very important, and forest alone can't do that job because there seem to be frogs that are adapted to live in coffee plantations. And then we looked at those other three variables that I spoke to you about, which is geographic distance, direct land distance, the stream network distance, and the elevation difference. And we found that the land distance and the stream distance didn't really make any difference to how different species were. Whereas if you look at elevation, you can see that all the points are along this line, right? They form this triangle. It's because the farther away any 2 points are in space, the more different they are in their frog species compositions. So ideally, if you have, two forest streams that are next to each other in elevation, they're going to have very similar kinds of frogs. Whereas even or even like a tea plantation and a forest next to each other in the same elevation will have very similar species. Whereas if you have a forest at low elevation versus a forest at high elevation, you'll have completely different species composition. And another thing we looked at was there were two watersheds in the study, which means all of the streams would drain into one river valley on one side and a different river valley on the other side of my study area. And we thought to also see if that makes a difference in what kind of species there are. And what we found interestingly was that in the stream frogs, there wasn't really much of a difference. It was the same set of species found in both watersheds. But whereas if you looked at the terrestrial frog, there's actually a slight difference here. So this was interesting again because we didn't expect that watershed would influence terrestrial frogs as much. And what we found actually was that the two watersheds were facing different aspects of the mountain. So one watershed was facing east of the Western Ghats, the other watershed was facing more to the west of the Western Ghats. And so that completely changes a whole bunch of other variables, I imagine, including weather and wind and rainfall and humidity and things like that. And maybe that's why the two aspects of the mountain seem to affect the terrestrial frogs more. So this, for me, at the landscape scale now, was interesting that we have coffee being distinct from forests compared to tea. We have elevation being really important to turnover, and then watershed being another important one, what terrestrial frogs. And so, in summary, we have these three scales that we've now looked at. So, if you were a small farmer and you want to be able to do something in your plantation, adding a microhabitat, even a lily pond in your backyard, is likely going to add a lot of species to your plantation. So, you're able to have a higher species richness in your farm. If you're a mid to larger scale plantation owner and you are able to save a larger area of the land, what you could focus on is torrents. So wherever you have fast flowing streams, you could focus on your conservation efforts on those kind of landscapes. And then with that final piece, which is the species composition. So at the landscape scale, you're a manager, you work in the department, you drive policy on what you can do and where you can, say, uh, designate funds to conserve in different locations, things that would become important for amphibians is you want to be able to use different land uses. We know that not all land uses seem to have similar species, so you want to put different conservation strategies in coffee, tea, and forest. You want to be able to do it across elevations, so you don't want to put all your conservation effort at one elevation, but try and do it across multiple elevations. So you're able to reach the most number of species, and then potentially those two watersheds I spoke about because they have different aspects. So these are the three spatial scales at which you could action conservation to do something for amphibians. And one way we could do all three is to focus on the waterways. So this, for example, is an image from North America where you have these flat fields, but you have a lot of softening of edges. So you don't have a field abruptly ending right next to a stream or right next to a water body or pond. You have forest buffers, linear buffers that separate agriculture from these freshwater bodies. And unfortunately, policies right now don't demand that we have soft edges between streams and plantations, especially where you saw in those tea plantations, the tea being grown right next to the stream edges, it really disturbs the stream habitats. So having something like this could really help um, improve amphibian conservation. It also provides a bunch of ecosystem services. These studies have found that it controls flooding, soil erosion, uh, it protects the water from pollution because a lot of these agricultural farms are highly chemically sprayed, and the trees prevent all of those chemicals from leaching directly into the water. So it provides a lot of other ecosystem service benefits. So right now we're working to try and see, can we recreate this? Where can we recreate this to make more sense? And we're using different scenarios where, uh, if I focus on, say, whether I want to uh, look at what is the best location to put stream buffers in if I wanted to just worry about soil erosion, or if I was only interested in crop diversity, or if I was only interested in the economics, so I don't want the crop to be damaged. So under different scenarios, where can we maximize these potential, and what scenarios would be best to try and put streams so that you have the least economic damage, the most amphibian species conserved, and have a lot of soil and water conservation potential. So we're trying to map that right now for these landscapes. We're also trying to work with the coffee growers. So whether they're individual plantation owners who own small farms, or they're big companies like Tata Coffee, Pari Agro, BBTC. These companies have large land holdings, like 1,000 acres upwards. So they're able to really set aside some areas for conservation, especially because, as their CSR indicates, they're also trying to be more sustainable, more eco-friendly. So we're talking to farmers to try and identify what are the locations where they would be willing to set aside some space for riparian restoration to recreate those forest buffers along stream edges, and then hopefully be able to look at how that helps amphibian populations to recover from the current state that they're in. And so we're monitoring these sites every year uh, over the last 4 or 5 years now. And so we'll try and see if once we're able to bring in those interventions, how that changes amphibians. And that's it. I can take questions if you have any, and it'd be nice to discuss any ideas you have.
Hi students, if you have any doubts, you can directly ask to Dr. Vishnupriya or put that in the chat box.
Sure. So the results of the watershed is what you mean? Let me pull up my slide again. Is this the one you were talking about? Okay, good. Yeah. So basically, like I said, we have two aspects of this mountain range. So we have streams that are east flowing. So they flow, the streams join together, form a river, flow down into Tamil Nadu and flow east. And then we have the west facing. So the streams join, form rivers, flow into Kerala and then out into the Arabian Sea. So these two watersheds are in different locations, right? So what we thought was that the stream frogs, because they're in two different watersheds, will be very different. So the kind of species that are on the eastern watershed will be very different from the kind of species on the western watershed. So the figure on the left is looking at those stream frogs. So uh, the 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 one here is one watershed, the one on the right is another watershed, and we're looking at what kind of species there are. And you can see that the orange boxes overlap, right? Which means that the species composition is basically the same. There is no difference in the kind of species that are in the two watersheds. But what is here on the right is the terrestrial frogs. So these are bush frogs, gliding frogs, frogs that live on land, in trees, and things like that. And because they are not water dependent frogs, I thought they will not be affected by which watershed they are found in. So I thought these species will actually be more similar. But interestingly, here the orange boxes don't overlap. Do you see that? They're slightly offset from each other. So what this tells me is that the species in one watershed, the terrestrial species in one watershed is slightly different from the terrestrial species in the other watershed. And why would that be? Is that they're actually not being influenced by the water itself, but the fact that one is east facing, the other is west facing, which means they might have very different climatic conditions. They might have different humidity, rainfall, wind, and so that is influencing the kind of terrestrial frogs that are found in these two watersheds. That's all I wanted to say. I hope that clarified it. Right. Does anyone else have any questions? Sure.
Hello, Vishnupriya ma'am. I am Shalmali. I am from first year Ferguson College. I had a question that you said that some frogs were specific to coffee plantation. So I was curious about which species were those, and in their natural habitats, when plantations are not there, which habitats do they prefer?
Yeah. So the frogs that we found more in coffee plantations were some of the gliding frogs and some mostly bush frogs and gliding frogs. So a lot of terrestrial species that were quite different in the coffee plantations and weren't found in forests. My inkling is that they are found in forests as well, but because coffee has a lot of that low shrub density, there's extra habitat for these bush frogs. And they have the canopy similar, slightly lesser than forest, but they still have some canopy cover. And they have a high shrub density. So bush frogs and gliding frogs that like vegetation to live in have, because forest undergrowth is not so thick. A lot of times you'll see forests having a lot of high canopy and less low canopy. So here there's very, very dense low canopy. And so they're probably adapting to that. And so that's what's making them much more abundant in these coffee plantations. They're probably found in forests as well, but at lower densities.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Welcome. In general, you see an increase in population of some endangered frogs. Our data is not long enough to show, you know, big changes in population right now, and also because of how hard it is to estimate population size and numbers, we've so far largely looked at presence. So, is the species present at a site or not every year? One of the things we're noticing is, apart from habitat, rainfall has been big. We've had big fluctuations because of climate change, right? So, for example, when I started this study, 2018 was a big flood year. We had the Kerala floods that year. All the streams were overflowing and flooding. And so there was an abundance of water. And then 2019 was a much drier year. Rainfall came only in July. And then was the total amount of rainfall was much lower during the monsoon. And there was a lot more in the post monsoon. And that again affected frogs. So what we found was that frogs were actually much lower in the drier year. We repeated the same thing in 2023 and 24. 23, if you remember, was an El Nino year, and parts of the Western Ghats got about 50-60% rainfall deficit. So had much lesser rainfall. Then 2024, the La Nina set in, we had much more rainfall, and so we saw a lot more amphibian activity in 2024. So one thing we're noticing is that frogs are much more abundant. We're encountering a lot more individuals in the wet years compared to the dry years. But how much it affects the population, how quickly populations recover from a dry year to a wet year, are things we'll need much more long-term data sets to actually be able to answer. And also, if we do restore habitats, how long will it take for populations to recover is something we haven't yet started restoring. We're still talking to landowners to try and see if you're able to do it. But it'll be nice to see if that does help some of these endangered species to recover.
Hi, Vishnupriya. This is Yash from Ferguson College. So I had two questions for you. First was, what factors did you consider while uh, deciding the sample size of your studies? And the second is, what are the general issues or constraints you face while studying Anuran communities? So these could be logistical and also technical issues as well.
Okay. So in terms of sample size with any study, if you've done a course in study design, you want randomization, replication, and interspersion. So randomization is that you want to randomly select sites, because if you select sites based on certain biases, you won't get a correct estimate of the population as it is. And the other thing is replication. So you want enough sites at which point you want to say that you have a fair idea of, okay, you have enough sites in coffee, enough sites in tea, or whatever your categories are, to say that this is a fair representation of the variation within this population. And interspersion is that ideally you don't want all your coffee in one area, all your tea sites in one area, all your forest sites in one area. You want them to be mixed across. So we tried to make sure that we did all of those, especially in the second study. The very first study, if you see, actually was done when I was still a student many years ago. And so we did have we ran into a problem where all of coffee was grown in high elevations, all of the rubber was grown in the low elevations, and areca was sort of grown across the different habitats. So we didn't have interspersion. Our sites were very clumped. All the coffee were in one area, all the rubber was in one area. So in some ways that kind of constrained what we were able to say about those communities. Is it the land use itself that's driving what we're seeing with species richness, or is it the fact of where these plantations are, right? So we tried to correct for that in the second study, where we tried to make sure that we had enough sites across the different land uses, but also that they're all mixed across different elevations and spatial locations. In terms of the exact number that we were able to pick, I mean, the more you add to your sample size, the better always, right? If I could go survey 1,000 streams, I would do it. But that's where logistical constraints come in. You get about 90 days of real monsoon, mostly 3 months-ish. So you're able to, and most of amphibians are generally active at night. So you're out doing these surveys in challenging weather conditions where it's really wet and raining, where you're encountering leeches and things, but also in far more dangerous conditions, because all of these are elephant country. So you're walking at night with low visibility, heavy rainfall, and elephant presence. So there's only so much that you can cover in that time. So given that, we try to do 1 or 2 streams every night. And so that's covered a total of 90 streams, 227 transects across the 2 years in that second study. But yeah, all of these are definite constraints that you're in very challenging conditions. Secondly, you're working on private lands. That makes people nervous because they don't know what you're doing. You're around at night collecting data, how that affects them. So you need to really build a healthy relationship with the landowners and the stakeholders, reassure them, be open and transparent with them, present your results to them so they have a reason to trust you, and continue to engage with them beyond the project study window, which is what we continue to do so that we can actually effectively contribute to conservation. Yeah, those are some of the big things I can think of right now.
Yeah, thanks. Also, I read your paper and I saw that the number of samples in different land uses were different. So, was that due to the habitat heterogeneity, or was there any other reason for that?
I think we try to keep it as similar as possible. But to some extent, for example, in Valparai, a large proportional landscape, over 80 to 85% of the landscape is tea. So you're going to be able to get tea sites much more easily, access them more easily than coffee or forest sites. And we were constrained by the fact that we didn't have forest department permits. So we had to stick to forest fragments that were found within tea plantations or coffee plantations rather than being able to go into the national park for forest sites. So all of those things constrained how many forest sites or coffee sites we could access. So that was definitely one of the constraints in this study. In the previous study, we tried to keep it similar. We got to 40 tea and 40 coffee, 40 rubber, 40 areca, and we were only able to get 33 coffee sites, I think, right now because of some logistical constraints. But we tried to keep it as similar as possible.
Yeah, thank you.
We can wrap up if there aren't any other questions.
Prabita?
Yes, if there is no other questions, we can wrap up. Or if still there is questions, you can students can post in Q&A. So Professor Umesh can pass to Vishnupriya, so she can also answer that.
Yes, I can do that. I can pass on questions that are posted on the discussion forum, especially after other people watch the recording of this talk, and they might have questions about that I can then pass on to Vishnupriya. Prabita, thank you so much for organizing this. Everybody, thanks for joining and participating, and thanks for all the discussion and the questions. And once again, thank you, Vishnupriya, for that lovely talk. And we hope to hear from you at some point in the future again as another iteration of this course. So thanks again and good evening all. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Vishnupriya. Thanks, Umesh. And NPTEL team, you can wind up the session.
Okay.